Hello everyone and welcome. Long time no see. I'm back after like 4 months with a Node.js API tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be focusing on using TypeScript, Node obviously, Express and MongoDB. It's going to be a series of tutorials, and the idea is that each tutorial is going to cover its own specific topic. So the only video you will have needed to have seen is this video, which is the setup video, and every other video you can watch just individually. You don't have to watch them all. You can just watch one, or you could watch them all, and it'll basically go through topics like authentication, queues, potentially WebSockets, stuff like that, all to do with creating APIs in Node.js. So hopefully it's useful, and it should be quite a long-running series, all being well. So in this video, we are going to go through actually setting up a project. We're going to get everything we need installed. We're going to create essentially a framework for which we can use later on in other tutorials. I'll put it on GitHub so you can use it yourself. Essentially, at the end of this tutorial, you can take what we've done here and just go crazy, start building your own APIs and use this as like a backbone for that. There is one thing to bear in mind, and I know people say like, oh, you should do something this way or something that way. There's a million different ways to do things, especially with what we're doing where there's no real structure. We're sort of just coming up with a structure on our own. There's a million different ways you could lay out a Node.js app, or any app for that matter. Different plugins, NPM packages and whatnot. Some might be better than others, and you might not like some of the things that I do. That's completely fine. If you want to improve upon something, or you feel like you can do something better, go for it. Feel free to leave comments, any improvements, and I can go over them later on, or not. But you can just do whatever you want to do. This is just going through how I do things. This is basically a culmination of quite a few years of using Node.js and reading a lot of different blog posts and seeing how other people do things. And this is just how I lay out pretty much every project I work on that's based around Node.js. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing we need to do is start off with a blank project. I've got this Node.js from scratch project. I'm just going to open up the command line. So the first thing we need to do is do npm init-y to start up our npm project, and this will add our package.json file. So after that, we have quite a few things to install. We're getting a lot of stuff that we need on this project sort of installed at the beginning to get it out of the way. So I'm going to run through them. What I'm going to do to make it easier for viewers is leave all the npm stuff in the description, not the comments, but in the description below the video. So you don't have to just write everything out. I think that'd be a lot easier, but it is important to take note of what we're installing. So I'm just going to do npm init, not init, just I, -d, and sorry, let me just move my mic a bit. There we go. So this will install everything as dev dependencies because there's this -d. So I'm going to copy and paste stuff, so just so I don't have to write it all down because there is a lot of stuff to go through here. So the first one is obvious, TypeScript. We're going to be using TypeScript for this. I'm going to assume that you have knowledge of what TypeScript is if you're watching this video. It's a bit out of the scope of this video to go through it, but maybe in the future I can do a tutorial on it if people are interested in that. The next thing we're going to be installing is tsc-watch. And what this will do, similar to NodeMon, if you're familiar with that, is it'll watch when we make changes in our TypeScript files, and if it does, it will run a command for us. In our case, we'll rebuild the project, essentially restart it, and then it'll use the new code. Then we've got ESLint, which if you're not familiar with that, it will highlight your code and tell you any errors, depending on how you set it up. So for us, we'll be setting it up to look through TypeScript code and tell us any potential errors with our TypeScript code. Then we've got Prettier, which is a plugin that will reformat our code, depending on how we set it up. So we're going to set it up, well, really, you can set it up however you want. But I use it when I save the file. So when I do Control-S, for example, it will reformat the code into proper formatted code. So essentially none of your code is a mess. Although that's the hope anyway. The next is eslint-config-prettier. That's just a config for eslint. I think it's in Prettier we use that, or is that, I think that's in eslint, but so that it knows that we use Prettier, something like that. Eslint-plugin-prettier. I'm not 100% sure what that does. A lot of this I just got from my projects, which I set up quite a while ago. TypeScript, this is the parser for ESLint for TypeScript. And then we've got the plugin for that as well. Then we've got types/node. So obviously we use Node, but unless you add the types for Node, it won't understand. TypeScript won't understand what you're doing when you're using Node-specific packages. So we just add that. Then we've got @types/express. Same thing for this. We'll be installing Express in a second. This will just make it so that it knows, it adds types for Express. So when we use anything related to Express, it has the types there, and TypeScript won't kick up a fuss. So we can install all that. Quite a lot. Again, I'll leave it in the description. But this will get a lot of the stuff we need out of the way, a lot of the setup stuff. And a lot of this is just to make our code writing a bit nicer. Is that no issues there, I don't think. I think we're all good. Yeah, so that's all installed. The next, we've only got 2 more to go. So npm I this time to install them as normal dependencies. And I'll write these ones. We've got Express, which is obviously our routing engine. And then we've got dotenv, which is, it will take env variables from our .env file and put them into process.env so that we can use them throughout our Node.js application. Ooh, I'm getting a lot of errors here, I think. Oh, I think that's fine. So the next thing we need to do is actually get our config file for TypeScript. So we do npm, or npx, actually, sorry, npx tsc -- init. And that will create our config file. Where are we? Here we go. So we've got tsconfig.json now. So a couple of things we need to do here. Where is it? We're looking for base URL. Here we go. So our base URL is going to be not // but /src. So all of our code is going to live in the source folder. So that's fine. Just check if there's anything else we need. There's one thing. Oh yeah, out directory. So that's called out_dir, wherever that is. Should be here. It's not there though. Hang on a minute. Let me do a search. Out. There we go. I don't know why that was so hard to find. So out directory is going to be dist. So this is where the code that we've compiled from TypeScript is going to live. So this is essentially where the vanilla JavaScript is going to live, and this is what you would actually run in a production environment. And just in general, this is what Node.js will actually run. There's one more thing we have to do, and it's to do with module-aliases, which should be just under our base URL stuff, if I can find it. Where's paths? Is it up here? Here we go. Okay. So, paths. Now, this is an interesting one. Paths will basically make it, and I'm just going to copy and paste what I have here for this part, and then explain what they're actually doing. So, it probably is pretty self-explanatory, but basically, we're going to have some folders, and so resources is where like our controllers and models and stuff will live. Utils is where utilities live, and middleware, where middleware lives. The problem with that is, if we need to get code from these, we usually have to do the relative path. So that can end up being something like this, and I'll just mess up this code quickly, but you might end up doing something like this. Import something from, and then you'd have to do, depending on where you are in the code, // resources. Now that's a pain in the ass. So what would be nicer is if we could do something like this, @/resources from anywhere in the code. And that's essentially what we're doing here. So let me just unmess up this. So that's what we're doing here. We're just basically aliasing @resources to resources. And it'll be the resources from, I think it'll use source as the root, whichever we've put as our root directory, I think, or our base URL. So that's it for our tsconfig. That's all fine. What we'll do now is in package.json, we will add our scripts. So scripts are what we're going to use to actually run the code. So let's add start. So start is going to be the script you run in production. Not when you're developing, but this will run the actual code that's been compiled from TypeScript into JavaScript. So we'll do node dist, and then our main file is going to be index.js, so that'll be the entry point. So when you go to launch this into production, you'll want to do npm run start. Then we have dev. This is what we'll run locally, so we'll do tsc-watch, and then, oh, sorry, I've got that issue again where the mic is in front of my keyboard, so I can't do anything. Right, success, / to escape this, node ./dist / index.js, and another / to escape that speech mark. And this is what we'll run in development. So we do npm run dev, and what it'll do is it'll keep an eye on our TypeScript files, and anytime anything changes, it'll rebuild the project and restart our server. We've got build, and this is just going to be tsc. So if you run this, that will build your TypeScript project. So essentially, compile it down into, I don't know if it's compile or transpile or whatever, I'm just going to say compile. Compile your TypeScript into JavaScript into the dist folder. And then what we're going to do is add something more out of convenience. But if we do npm run build, so this post install will run after you do an npm install. And that's quite useful if, for example, someone pulls your API from GitHub or something, and when they run npm install, it will automatically build the project for them, which is quite useful. I think in production environments as well, let's say you pull from your source control and do an npm install as part of your deploy, it will automatically build the project so it's ready to run straight away, which is quite useful. Alternatively, you could just run npm run build like just manually after, that's fine as well. But this is quite convenient to have. So that's the package.json pretty much done. What I'm going to go through now is ESLint and Prettier setup. Now, a couple of things you'll need for this. If we look at my extensions, I've got a load of rubbish that you don't need to care about, but ESLint, you'll need ESLint, the plugin for that, if you're using VS Code, that is, and the Prettier plugin as well. I'm not going to cover them completely in this tutorial because this is just part of the API setup. You can, if you want to, skip this part, maybe come back to it later, or look at just setting up Prettier and ESLint on your own. That's fine. They're not vital for this. It's just nice to have them. So those plugins you'll need to install, there's probably going to be an equivalent of those plugins for whatever text editor you're using, so you'll need to look into that. I'm just using VS Code. You can just find them by searching up here. So let's just add the files. There's two files we'll need for this. There is .eslint-rc.js. I think I spelled that wrong. Yeah, that's quite normal for me. eslint-rc, there we go. And then another file, which is going to be fairly similar, but prettier-rc.js. There we go. So let's do Prettier first. Prettier is going to be module. Oh, I just did. Okay, that went well. Module. Is it going to try and okay exports? Yeah, that's sometimes VS Code will just try and fill things in for you, and it's usually not what you want at all. So sorry about that. tab width is going to be 4, so it's going to set the tab width for our files. Single quote. This is all like completely down to you, by the way. You can choose whatever you want to do. This is just a style that I follow. Single quote going to be true, if I can spell that right. And then semi is going to be true, and that's talking about semicolons. So in our, JavaScript doesn't necessarily need semicolons technically, but when I'm working on the backend stuff, I prefer to have semicolons. But that's preference. Although I think in TypeScript that might be enforced. I'm not 100% sure about that one. ESLint, pretty much the same thing in terms of the module that exports. We're going to add the parser, so this is where we use the parser we installed at the beginning. So at TypeScript, and it's -eslint. Why can I not spell parser? It could have something to do with the fact that I can't see my keyboard. Extends. I really need a better mic setup. Plugin. TypeScript -eslint. eslint / recommended. Oh my god, that was the worst spelling. Okay, good. I might just copy these last two because I can't type. Oh, it's gonna be a nightmare. So the next two, Prettier / at TypeScript -eslint and plugin : Prettier / recommended. Pass options. That's an object. ECMA version 2018. Source type is going to be module, because we're going to be using modules. And rules is going to remain empty for now. And that's pretty much it done for our setup of ESLint. tsconfig is throwing oh yeah, okay, so it's throwing an issue. I think because we don't have a .source folder. I think that's part of it, but that's fine. We're going to add that later. The next thing we're going to go through is something quite important, especially if you're planning on pushing to source control, so like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, that kind of thing. So that is going to be a .gitignore. So in here, we want to ignore our dist folder because we don't want to be pushing that. It's a bit unnecessary because you can just use the TypeScript code to build the dist folder. There's no real need to push the dist folder. The same with node modules. All the modules you need are in package.json, so you can just install them. There's no need to push them. That'd be a lot of code to push. And the next one, which is more of a privacy thing, is .env. So you don't want to push your .env because that's going to have all your information, like your API keys, that kind of thing. So you don't want to push that, but what we'll do is create something we do want to push to do with .env, and that's .env.example. So what will go in here is basically an example of what your .env will look like. So for us, we want to have node.env equals development port, and these are just going to be some default values, so 3000. Then we want to do, and we're going to leave these ones empty, mongo path equals, and this is going to be all the setup for MongoDB, mongo user equals, and then mongo password equals. So .env.example will go into your source control. It basically just gives users, like other developers, an example of what they need to include. And then we're going to create a .env, which we can fill out now. I'm actually going to copy and paste it because I've got all the information. So this is my MongoDB stuff. Two ways that you could use MongoDB, either through Docker, which I have something here which might be useful for people. If you know how to use Docker, and specifically Docker Compose, this will be useful for you. There is another file which is related to this part here, which is mongo-init.js. So this will create a user. It doesn't seem to work for me. I haven't debugged it yet, so I'll have a look into what causes that. But yeah, this should work fine, and then you basically just use the admin users. It's a local database. There is not much of an issue. But this should work if you're using Docker. If you're not using Docker, then MongoDB Atlas is probably where you want to go. And I'll go through it a little bit later. Not Atlas, but I'll go through a couple of potential changes you need to make in regards to this path here. Or not really this one, but this path is essentially going to be used in the code. But we'll go through it later. But yeah, you could use MongoDB Atlas, which is MongoDB's sort of cloud hosting platform. And they give you a free MongoDB database. So yeah, I might end up leaving a link to that in the description. If you want to use that, that's probably the easiest way to do it if you're not familiar with Docker. So it's a bit out of the scope of this video, but how you want to set it up is really up to you. But yeah, this is where you'd put your information for connecting to MongoDB. So the next thing we need to do is add the module-alias package. So we'll do npm I module-alias. So this relates to the thing we did earlier in the tsconfig file. If we go down here, we can see these paths here. Basically, when they're done in the tsconfig, they only apply to TypeScript, and you need the vanilla JavaScript equivalent in order for them to work properly. So these ones we use in TypeScript, and then the ones that we're going to add in here, which we'll add now, remember how to do it, is these ones are going to be used in the vanilla JavaScript. Let me just Aliases. And it's basically going to be the same as what was in our TypeScript, because if they're not, they wouldn't work. So you have to make sure that these ones @/resources are and @/utils and middleware are the same as the ones in here @/resources. You can see. So yeah, the only difference really is that in the case of these ones here, they're going to be referencing the dist folder, because in tsconfig it's going to be using the source folder, and then in the JavaScript equivalent it's going to be using the dist folder. So the next thing we're going to do is create the actual structure of the project. So now we're going to finally create the source folder. So if we do just source. I was thinking of doing paths then. Then we do middleware. So this will be where all our middleware goes. And then inside of source again, we do resources, and this is where all the resources go. So in our example today, we're going to be creating essentially blog posts. And for that, we have a post resource, which represents a blog post. So that's just an example of one resource that you could have. You could have users, for example. And then one more folder let's create a file. One more folder is going to be utils, and this is where things that are useful to us but aren't really related to any specific resource are going to go. So we're going to have interfaces in here and stuff like that, and useful functions that we're going to use throughout the code, but they don't really belong in middleware or resources. And then two more files that we need to create. We need to create app.ts, and this is going to be not technically the entry point into the application, because that's going to be index.ts, but it is going to be the setup. So we're going to set everything up. We're going to initialize MongoDB, all of our routers and stuff like that. Last thing we need is index.ts, and this will be our entry point. So the first thing we're going to get on with, and this is where we actually start writing some code, so quite exciting, is writing our app.ts file. That's a good place to start. So if we go to app.ts, and we're going to import some things that don't exist yet. So don't worry about that, just follow along with me, and what we'll do is we'll go through all the stuff that doesn't exist and add it a little bit later, so that's fine. So we're going to import Express, and then we're also going to import from the same package, application. So that's from Express. We're going to import mongoose from mongoose. and that's not installed yet, so we'll go through that in a second. We're going to import compression, which is a middleware for compressing the requests, and we'll import that soon as well. Probably would have been better to import them first so that we could use autocomplete, but that's fine. Import cause from cause. Again, this is another middleware that we're going to be using. This will set up cause, so it'll allow requests from like different origins and stuff. Import Morgan from Morgan. Morgan is a logging tool which is quite useful. Useful for us in development because it will give us an idea of the requests that have been made and things that have gone wrong. So it's quite useful. Import controller from, and then this is where we finally get to use aliases, so you can see how useful they are. @utils/interfaces. So we haven't created this yet, but what we'll have is a folder of interfaces that are sort of just not really related to any specific resource. So in this case, it's going to be a controller interface, and that's going to be controller.interface. So that's sort of our structure. Is you have the name and then like dot what it is, .ts. So we have controller.interface, so it's an interface. It's just an easy way of keeping track of what things are. So at a glance, you can see, oh, that's a model, that's a controller, that's an interface, for example. Import error middleware, which we'll create in a second, from this is going to be middleware, and then error and dot middleware. So we can tell that that's a middleware. And then one last thing, which is going to be a security related thing, is import helmet from helmet. So helmet will help prevent common attacks that would be made against an API, for example. So what we'll do is create class called app, public express, and this is just going to be the type of application which we imported up here, and then public port, and that's going to be a number. And this is ESLint doing this, by the way. It's telling us that we've initialized a property, but it isn't being used, and it hasn't even been assigned yet. So we're going to actually assign this in the constructor. So we'll do constructor, and this is going to accept two arguments. The first one is going to be controllers, and this is going to be type controller, but it's going to be an array of controllers, and then port number. And inside of the constructor, we're going to do this.express. So we're going to finally assign express to express. So this will start up our routing. Then we're going to do this.port is equal to port. Then we're going to have some more functions that we haven't actually defined yet. So this.initialize database connection. This.initialize middleware. Okay, fine. And then this.initialize controllers. And we're actually going to pass in controllers for this one. And what this will do, this function will loop through the controllers, and it'll make a little bit more sense later when we actually create a controller. But essentially what controllers will actually contain is the routes that they use, and then what we can do with that is like add them to Express. So Express knows, okay, that's a route that exists, and it knows where to route it to. So it'll make a little bit more sense when we actually come to write this function. And then the last thing we need, and it's important that this is last, is initialize error handling. Now, as far as I'm aware, when it comes to Express error handling, the error middlewares, the error handling middleware has to come last. So yeah, I'm adding that last, initializing that last on this. If we go through, and it's probably better that we install everything we need now. and then keep going, because all these red lines, it bothers me. So I'm gonna install everything we need now, just to get rid of all of these red lines. So I'm gonna copy and paste again, but what I'll do is put the command in the description like I did with the other one. So we need mongoose, we need compression, we need cause, we need Morgan, and we need helmet. So those are our normal dependencies that we need to install, and then we've got a few dev dependencies as well, just for the types for some of these. So if I do npm I and then -d instead of what it was before, just npm I. So we need that -d for dev dependencies, and we do @types compression, @types cause, and @types Morgan. Some of these have the types included in them in their package, so we don't actually need the types for those ones. Like I think did we? Oh no, we installed Express early, didn't we, with types? Yeah. I think mongoose is what I'm thinking of, which has types added by default, so we don't need to install types for them. Yeah, that's got rid of a lot of the red lines. We just need these two bits of code here, which we can add a little bit later. What we'll do is we'll get started on the rest of these functions. So the first thing we'll do is write private initialize, and this will be middleware. And we need a return type on these because TypeScript is in strict mode at the moment, so it'll tell us off for not having a return type. But in this case, we're actually not returning anything, so it's just going to be void. And now we'll just add all these middlewares that we need. So we need express dot use, and we'll start off with helmet, and that needs to be called like that. So express dot use cause, this dot express dot use again, and then we'll use Morgan. Sorry, the fact that my mic is in the way is making it really difficult to type. It's not good for a tutorial where essentially all you're doing is typing. Once again, this .express.use. This will be express.json. So what this will do is it will take any JSON that comes through as like a post request, for example, and add that to, I think it adds it to body. I don't know if it says it if I hover over it. Yeah, so it'll pass JSON requests essentially. A similar thing that we're going to do now, but instead it's going to be for form encoded stuff. So, or URL encoded, sorry. URL encoded, and then extended false. Okay. And then the last thing is going to be use compression. So that will compress our requests to make them smaller, which is always nice. The next thing will be another private initialize controllers. And of course, we've passed in controllers to this one as well. So the type is going to be an array of controllers. And the return type, once again, is going to be void. And what we're going to do with this is do controllers.forEach. And then controller. It's going to be a type of controller. And then an arrow function. This.express.use. And this this path that we're going to add here, we're going to do /API, and that'll be the base path of everything. So for example, later on when we add our posts controller, it will be, the URL will be /API/ and then posts, and then that'll be the same for every other resource. It'll always start with /API. So you can change this to whatever you want really, /API, and then if you have a different version, you do like v3, that kind of thing. So that just makes it a bit more convenient. And then we'll do controller.router, and we'll add error handling as well. Initialize error handling. Once again, this is going to be void. This.express.use error middleware. And again, we'll define that soon. Second to last thing we need is another private, and then initialize database connection. So this is where we initialize our MongoDB connection. So what we're going to do now is get some variables from our env, process.env. So const, and we're going to destructure the object. And we're going to get Mongo user, Mongo password, Mongo path, and that's going to come from process.env. And we're going to add some stuff a little bit later on. We still need to add .env, as in the code, so it actually includes all the .env stuff. And I've got something else that will validate that we've got all the env variables that we need, but we'll add that a little bit later on. So now we're going to do mongoose.connect, and this is where things kind of potentially differentiate. I think you can do it the same way, but basically if you're using MongoDB Atlas, the only difference for you will be that you do MongoDB plus SRV. It's something to do with like DNS related stuff. So for me, I'm using Docker, so mine's set up to just do MongoDB : // If you're using MongoDB Atlas, you can do SRV plus SRV. But I think you can just do this how I'm doing it now as well, and it should work fine. But that's something to bear in mind just in case. So the first thing we need is Mongo user. So we're setting up the string now, the connection string. Then we need the password for that user. So we'll do Mongo password. Then we need the path. So we can do Mongo path. And you can see how it's using our env variables to set up MongoDB. And that should be it for that. One more thing we need, and this is to start everything up really, is, or at least make it accessible to the outside world, is listen. So if you've ever done Express, you'll probably know what I'm about to do. But basically, I'm going to do this.express.listen, and I'm going to pass in this.part, which is what we defined earlier, and then a function as a second parameter, just to say that the app is up and running. App listening on part. Can't type. And then this dot part. There we go. And perfect. So the last thing we need to do is export that so that we can use it later on. App. Okay, so before we move on to writing index, what we'll do is cover writing this interface and this middleware. So if we do that now, so we'll need, inside of utils, we'll need a new folder called interfaces. And inside of that, a new file, which will be controller.interface.ts. And a fairly simple interface, really. We're going to import router from Express. We're going to define the interface, controller, and that's going to require path, and that's going to be a string, and it's going to be router, and that's going to be a type of router. So either we can put the export default here, which I think I might do actually, or put it below. It depends how you want to lay it out. So for example, I could put it here, which I might just leave it like this, but really it's up to you how you want to do that. I tend to put the export default at the bottom if I'm dealing with like classes or really anything big. I'll put export default at the bottom just to keep some code out of the way. It's not a lot, but some of the code out of the way. And then interfaces, if they're small interfaces, I might just put them export default there, just before the interface controller. Up to you what you do. I'm going to leave it like this, but really, that's just preference. The next thing we'll do is add the error middleware. So if we do a new file in middleware and call it error.middleware.ts, and we're going to import a few things from Express again. So we're going to do request, response, next function, and then that's going to be from Express, and then we're going to import something else. And this is annoying because we don't actually have this thing yet. This is another thing that we're going to have to create ourselves, but it's going to be a HTTP exception from, and this is going to be from utils exceptions. So another folder where we're going to, so we've got the interfaces folder, and then we're going to create an exceptions folder to store exceptions. We're only actually going to create one for now, but if you ever need more exceptions in the future, you can store them there. http.exception. So let's quickly create that. So in utils, create another folder called exceptions, and a new file called http.exception.ts. Another fairly small file, thankfully. Class http exception. It's going to extend, I think it's Node's default error or just JavaScript's default error, I forget which one. It's going to have a public status, which is going to be of type number, and this will be the status, so like 400 or 200 or whatever of the request. Public, or the response, public message, and that's going to be a string. And then we're going to have a constructor, and that constructor is going to accept two arguments, both the status and the message. So we're going to call super to call the constructor on the error, and that's going to accept the message. So essentially what we're doing is creating an error but specific to HTTP exceptions. So we'll do this dot status equals to status, and this dot message is equal to message. Okay, so again, export that, and like I said, usually when I'm dealing with classes, I'll put the export default at the bottom just to make it feels a bit cleaner to me. I think instead of having more text on the top, that just looks cleaner to me, but again, up to you. We'll go back to our error middleware, and we should have that now. It may not update immediately, so if we just do something like this, exception / there we go, so now it recognizes that we have it. We'll do a function in here, and it's going to be the error middleware function, which is going to be the same as pretty much any other middleware that you would use, but we're just going to pass in error as well. That's going to be a HTTP exception. Rec is going to be request. Res is going to be response. And next is going to be next function. And that's going to return void. There we go. So we'll do const status, and we'll do error.status. If we don't have that, we're just going to put it as a 500 by default, and const message is equal to error.message, or if we don't have that, we'll just put something went wrong, and that's just going to be default. If something fails and we don't know exactly what fails, we'll just return something went wrong to the user, and they can contact our support and complain. That's okay. And we will do res.status. We'll pass in the status passed in stat status dot send, and what we'll do is we'll send the status code and the message. All right, and then we need to export this so we can use it later. So we do export default error. It's lowercase, sorry, error middleware. There we go. Okay, so that is, I think, everything we need for our app.ts error middleware. Let me just check why that's not working. Oh, right, okay. I think I know why. So, yeah, so that's actually, you're not meant to put that as a function. It's just, yeah, you just pass it in like that. So get rid of the parentheses that you put on there and just pass it in. That should work. Next thing we need to do is get index.ts. So the first thing we need to do, and it's important that we do this before everything else, is import dotenv. So if we do dotenv/config, so essentially what this will do is it will take all of our variables we put into here, into our .env file, and then add them to process.env. So it's best that we do this as soon as possible so that we have them available to use throughout the application. The next thing we're going to do, again, we need to do before everything else, is import module-alias /register. Okay. And that will register all of our module aliases so that it can be used, again, throughout the application. Next thing we're going to do is, once again, I know this is going to annoy you, we're going to import something that doesn't exist yet, but we'll write it in just a second. So we're going to import validate env from, and then we're going to use utils again, at utils /validate env. So we'll write that in just a second. We're going to import app from ./app. Then we're going to import, oh no, we're not going to import it yet. So the next thing I have on here is post controller, which we're going to create a little bit later, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to save that until the end, and then we'll import it into here and then set it up. So we'll leave that for now. Validate env is just going to be a function that we call like that. And what that will do is it'll go through our env file and check that we have everything set that we need. But we'll write that in just a second. We'll do const app equals new app, so we'll initialize it here. Got an empty array. This will be the array of controllers. So like I mentioned a second ago, the post controller is the one that we're going to create in this tutorial. We'll import that when we actually create it, but this is when we pass it in so that it can be used in the setup process. Then we're going to pass in a number, which is going to be process.env.port. So that'll pass in the port, and then we're going to do app.listen. App.listen, there we go. And that's where we'll expose our API to the outside world and allow it to be accessed through whichever port we specify. So what I'm going to do now is create this validate.env. So we're going to create this in utils. So we do a new file, validate env. And validate env is quite useful. It's one of those things where it's a little bit of a hassle to set up. Or not really much of a hassle, but it's like, oh, why would I set this up? Seems pointless, but it's actually quite useful. So what we'll do is we need to install something first. So we'll do npm i env-valid. This is a library that we're going to be using to validate the env. So once that's installed, and go back, and we do import. Again, I'll leave that in the description, by the way, so you can just copy it from the description. Clean env. So that'll be the function we use. String and then port. So these are two types that we're going to use to basically validate the values and make sure that they are the same as the types. I think that'll make more sense in a second. So we'll import env-valid and get rid of the hashtag. Function validate env. This is going to be void again. I'm going to use this function that we imported, cleanenv. And the first argument is going to be process.env. So this is where we're going to get the actual env files from, because at this point, remember, we've already got them in process.env. So what it will do is it'll check process.env and match them against essentially our validation rules that we're going to add now. So the first one is nodenv, and we want that to be a string, which is why we imported str, and that's going to accept an object. And there's a plethora of settings you can do that you can pass through, one of which is called choices, and that essentially sets some potential choices that you can choose from. And if it doesn't match one of these choices, it will count it as invalid. So to give you an example, the choices that we have for our env, nodenv is going to be development or production. And basically, if we pass in something that doesn't match one of these two, it will say it's invalid and it won't run the application. So this is essentially what this is doing, is making sure that we have everything we need to run the application without failing. So the next one is going to be Mongo password, and for this we just want it to be a string, and we just want to check that it exists, and we can do that just by passing string. And the next one is going to be Mongo path. Once again, we just want it to be str. Oh, I can't type again. Mongo user. Once again, just string. Oh, I keep typing the entire thing. I'm getting too used to TypeScript now, so I'm just, anytime I need to do some sort of type string, I just put the entire thing. Part is going to be part, and we can actually do another option here and specify a default. So if we do default, and we can put that to 3000. So if in our end file the part doesn't exist, it will just set it automatically to be 3000. So technically speaking, we don't need to add the part, but we're going to do it anyway. I mean, it already exists, so we're going to do it anyway, and it's better that you do include it. But if somebody doesn't include it, not the end of the world, it would just set it to 3000. So that's that done. App.ts is done. So now we can finally get on to writing some of the code that's, so far this has all just been set up. The code that we're about to write is going to be actual sort of API code and functionality as part of the API. So as far as we're concerned, the setup is done now, thankfully. Took a while, but once it's done, it makes everything more convenient now that we have all this stuff installed and ready to go. So now we're going to start and actually write some code. Okay, so let's get started on writing our post resource. So in your resources folder, if you create a new folder called post, and what we're going to do is create all the files we'll need, and it's going to seem like a lot, but bear with me, it's not as crazy as it's going to look. Basically, all the code that we're going to write is code that we would have to write anyway, and just split it into different files, and it makes it look like a lot more than it actually is. So the first thing we'll do is add the post controller.ts. Then we'll add post model.ts. Then post interface.ts. So you can start to see it's quite a lot. Post service.ts. And last one, post.validation.ts. Now, validation is to do with making sure that somebody passes in the right parameters when making a request. So if they make a post request to like create a post, it makes sure that a title and a body will exist. So quite important, but one thing to bear in mind, it does require another middleware, so we're going to have to write that at some point, but we'll get to that when we need it. So the first thing we'll do is write the interface. So I think some people might store the interface in the model, which would remove this interface file. However, yeah, I prefer to just have it separately so I can use it throughout the code without having to import the entire model. So we'll do import document from mongoose. So this interface, and we'll do export default up here instead. This interface is going to extend document. Extends document. The reason for this is essentially, I can't type, right? Essentially, we want to be able to access all of the properties and methods associated with mongoose documents, because essentially anytime we use post, it's probably going to be a mongoose document. So it'll have things like _ID and that _v, all of the methods associated with mongoose, and we want to be able to access them. And to do that, we need to extend documents. You can actually click into it and see all the stuff that you have. So it's got things like delete one and stuff like that. So that'll just expose that functionality, or at least it'll make TypeScript aware of that functionality. So quite simple. We just need title, string, and body string. Nothing crazy for now. So just those two. So that's quite easy. We'll do the model next. Again, it's going to be quite simple. So we'll do import schema, and then model, and that'll be from mongoose. And then we're going to import our interface that we just defined. So post from, and this is a bit of a weird one because we're using our aliases. So this is probably one of those rare cases where using the alias is actually longer than just using relative paths. So just to keep things like looking consistent throughout the code base, I'm going to keep using the alias, but you may want to use a relative path because technically speaking, you could just do this post interface. And that's fine if you want to do that, and it's completely up to you. But I'm gonna use the interface, the module-alias, sorry, just to keep the code consistent across the application. And it doesn't add too much to it. It's just, yeah, it just looks sort of the same as all the other files that use the alias stuff, which is going to be all of the files. Const post schema, and that's going to be equal to new schema. And inside of here, we can do title, which can have a type of string. It's going to be required true. Body. It's going to be type of string again. And basically the same as the other one. Required true. Yeah, so same as title. What we're going to do is we're going to add timestamps to this. Sorry, the format. This is one of the things that sometimes goes wrong with Prettier, where it does this. It does the formatting when you don't really want it to, because I want to do this. So I want to do timestamps is true. So if I save now, yeah, there we go. So that's formatted correctly. Export default model, and this is going to be, it's a template, so we're just going to pass in the type post, and then it's going to be the name of the model is post, and then the schema it uses is going to be post schema. And that's it for our model. So now we can we can move on to our controller. Now the controllers are probably going to be the biggest bits of code you write, besides maybe services actually. So we've got this this post service here. Let's close that down. This post service here. So this will contain like business functionality. I think they call it business logic is what people call it. And your controllers will be in charge of routing to that logic, essentially. So in here, we're going to import some things from Express. So we've got router, request, response, and next function. And that's going to be from Express. Then we're going to import controller, the interface that we defined earlier. And this is one of those times where the module alias comes in really handy. Otherwise, we'd have to do // and stuff. So we've got @utils /interfaces /controller interface. And then we're going to import HTTP exception from is it @utils or no? Oh yeah, that is, yeah. Utils, I thought we were talking about the middle one then. Utils, and then we'll do import, and we don't have this yet, but we'll add it in a second. Validation middleware. So this will be used for our validation to make sure that users are submitting the correct information. And this is going to be in middleware /validation.middleware. Quite simple middleware, and we'll add it in a second. Import validate from, and this is going to be @resources post dot validation. So we'll write that in a second, and post service from @post/post.service. So that's everything we need imported. What we'll do is create a class called postController, and that's going to implement controller. And basically, interfaces will just tell us what we need to include on this controller when we implement them. So we'll do, if we hover over that, we can see it's missing the following properties from type controller: path and router. So we need public path, and that's going to be equal to /posts. And remember, we had that API, that /API earlier in app.ts. So you can see we're doing /posts here, so that'll be added on to /API. So when we want to access this, it will be /API /posts. Then we want public router equal to router. So we'll create, I believe they call them subrouters, and that subrouter will be added to the main Express router. We have a constructor, and that's going to be this dot initialize routes. So in a few minutes, when we've finished all the code, we'll actually instantiate this class inside of index.ts. And when we call that, it'll initialize the routes because it'll call the constructor. So quite useful for setting things up. So we'll just add this function for now. We won't add anything yet, but initialize routes, and that'll be returning void. And yeah, we'll just leave that blank for now. What we'll do is we'll go through and write some of these things. So we could do with adding the validation middleware. So in middleware, if we add a new file, validation.middleware.ts. I might make that just a little bit bigger, so you can see the file names. And inside of here, we're going to import some more stuff from Express. Request, response, next function, and request handler. From Express. And then, we need to install something actually, once again. So just one more thing to install. I think this is the last thing to install in the entire video, so that's good. npm install joy, which is a validation library. So let's have a look. Import joy from joy. And we'll do function validation middleware, and we'll do the schema, and that's going to be of type joy.schema, and the return is request handler. So we'll do request handler and open curly braces will return async rec. It's going to be request res response and then next function. Okay, it's going to return a promise. It's going to be void and using arrow functions we'll do const validation options. So I'll try and go through these options the best I can. So the first one is abort early. That's going to be set to false. And abort early, what the validation middleware will do is go through all the data that's been passed through, validate it with the validation options that we pass through. Essentially the schema up here. So when we pass through this schema, it'll validate against the schema, and abort early will basically make it so that on the first validation failure, it will stop the request and return back to the user all of the errors. But if we don't do abort early, it will keep going and then find any more errors it can. And I think that's more useful for the end user. So for example, if we had like a login form that used like username and password, instead of just failing on username, let's say they didn't provide a username and it failed on that and then said, you need to add a username. Let's say they also didn't pass through a password. They wouldn't know that, or like they did pass through a password but it wasn't valid, for example. It would tell them that. But if you aborted early, it wouldn't tell them. But if you didn't, it would add that to the list of errors and then tell the end user, oh, you also didn't, type in the password correctly, for example. So I think that's more useful. But I mean, it depends on your situation, I suppose. Allow unknown. So for some bizarre reason, I can't spell that. But allow unknown is going to be true, and this will allow values that aren't part of the schema. So it won't fail if something's passed through that isn't part of the schema. That's because we don't want it to fail pointlessly like that. That seems a bit pointless, a pointless way to fail. So what we can do actually to sort of mitigate that is do strip unknown. So we're sort of allowing them to submit data that isn't part of our schema, but then we're also stripping it out and get rid of it because we don't need it. So this will stop it from crashing if something unknown appears, and this will get rid of the unknown stuff. So I think they work quite nicely together. And then inside of a try catch, we're going to do const value equals await schema dot validate async rec dot body, and then validate options, and then we're going to set rec dot body to value, and essentially value is going to be equal to the data that's passed through after being compared to the schema and applying these options. So it'll strip all the unknown data and validate that the data is all valid, and then assign it to rec.body, and then call next so that we can continue with the request. Or what might happen is if it fails, and we'll change this to an E, we can create a const of errors, and that's going to be an array of strings, and we'll just set it to an empty array for now, and we'll do e.details, which is where all the errors would be stored, and then we'll call for each error, which is going to be equal to joy.validation error item, and then we're going to have a function that's just going to push the error.message into the errors array. Hang on a minute. Errors.push. That should be fine. I spelled it wrong. That's why it's kicking up a fuss as usual. Res.status. And we'll just set it to 400 because something's gone wrong. And what we'll do is we'll send through the errors so we can display them on either it could be through an API request, you know, from a third party that's using our API and it says, oh, you can't do that, or in like a React application, for example. I don't think we need this errors colon errors. I think we can just call it errors like that, and it'll automatically set it to errors. But I'll just leave it like that for now. And then let's export this. Export default validation middleware, and that should give us our validation middleware. There was 2 slashes there, I don't know why. So now what we need to do is add validate, and what this is going to be is the specific schema for our post stuff. So if we go into the validation file and we do import joy from joy, we'll do const create equals joy dot object, and then inside of this object we're going to expecting to see a title, so we'll do joy dot string dot required, and we're also going to want to see a body, so joy dot, it's going to be basically the same thing, string dot required, and we're going to export default, and what we're going to do is export an object with this create in it, because the idea of this file is that it contains all of the validation we'll need to perform actions on our post resource. So for example, we've got create, but we could have update, for example, and that's also going to essentially request the same stuff, but we'll do update. And then inside of our controller, when we import this, we can import create and update at the same time, and we just do validate.create and validate.update depending on what action we're performing. For now, we just need create, so we can get rid of update, but we'll keep it like that to make it easier in the future. When we add stuff, we'll know what we're doing. And now we should have that available, so we can actually start writing some code here in our controller for the actual API functionality. So what we'll do is we'll do this dot router. So we're going to add a route to this router we've defined up here, and it's going to be a post route. And first thing we're going to do is add the path, because we're sort of following REST API or RESTful, what would you call it, sort of paradigm. Basically, we're making a REST API. You can do whatever you want, but in a REST API, when you want to create a resource, you do. So, for example, ours is called post, is a post resource. So, if we want to create a resource, we'd send a post request to /posts to create one. So that's what we're going to do here essentially. So we can do this dot path. So that'll set the path for the route that we create into /posts, and because this is added to the router inside of here as well, it'll also have /API in front of it. So essentially, all of the paths that we define in here will have /API in front of them. So just good to bear that in mind in case you're struggling to send a request to your API. Validation middleware. So this is where we can finally use our validate stuff. So create, and then the final thing is going to be the actual request handler we want to call as part of this request. And in our case, it's going to be create. We haven't actually added this function yet, so we'll do private create, and this is going to be equal to async, and inside of here we've got rec res next. And it's going to return a promise of either response or void. There we go. And we will do, so we'll do an arrow function. And inside of here, we'll do a try catch. Because we're doing async await code, we do try catches to catch any errors. So what we'll do is we need to get the title and the body from rec.body. So if we do another destructure on the object, so we do title body, and that's going to be equal to rec.body. So essentially this creates two consts, one for title and one for body, so we can use them separately later. We haven't actually created post service yet, so you can just sort of follow along the code, but we'll create this a little bit later. So const post equals, and it's going to be equal to await this dot post service dot create, and then we're going to pass in title and body to this. And what this will do is we'll create this post service that has all the functionality we need for posts, so like create, update, delete, that kind of thing. And what we'll do is we'll use them instead of writing the logic directly into the handler, the request handler. We'll use a service, and that provides some advantages. Let's just add this first. So we'll return the status 2 or 1 to indicate that we've created an object, and then we'll return some JSON, and it's going to be post. So we'll return the post that's just been created. So using a service is useful, mostly, and this is what I found, mostly because if you want to like create a post somewhere else in your code, it's nice to have it inside of a service and not inside of a request handler, because a request handler is very specific to Express, and you may want to create a post as part of something else. So post probably isn't the best example. Let's say emails, for example. If you wanted to send an email, you may want to send an email as part of a queue, which is something we're gonna look at later on in the series. And basically, you don't want to be sending a request to your own API. It would be better just to call the email service and use the send function that's in that service, as opposed to having an endpoint that sends emails. That's much easier, and you can use it as part of the queue. So it probably doesn't make too much sense as to why that's useful now, but it is very useful to have that sort of everything inside of this post service, so we can use it anywhere inside the code. So now what we're going to do is just return an error. If there is an error, we'll just return an exception, HTTP exception 400, if I can see the number. Cannot. It's getting worse. Cannot create post. I think for my next video I need to look into the position of my mic. So what this will do is it'll send this HTTP exception through to our error handler, which is up here. And as you can see here, it's expecting an error of type HTTP exception. And then it'll use the status and the message we pass through, which is here, 400 and cannot create post, and send that to the user. So that's quite useful. The last thing we need is this post service, which is going to be quite simple to do. We just need to import the post model. And that's another thing actually about using services, is that any of the models that we use, we import them into the service and not into the controller, so it sort of keeps the controller as least cluttered as possible, which is quite nice. I know when I've been doing stuff, I haven't used services and my controller becomes a mess. So having the services just splits things up a little bit, which is quite nice. I'm going to import that from @resources/post model. And then we also want to import post, which is going to get a bit confusing. This is basically going to be the interface Some people, when they do interfaces, they call them like iPost, the I being interface. You can do that if you want. I've never done that. I've sort of just based it on, I guess, the context that it's in, so I can tell that that's an interface quite easily by how I use it and stuff. But if you find it confusing, feel free to call it like iPost. I think I've read about people sort of discouraging that. Not 100% sure why. When it comes down to sort of the format that you use for your code, it's not really about what you do, it's more about consistency. So as long as your code is laid out and then formatted the same way throughout your code base, that's usually fine. So if you do iPost, for example, there's no issue with that as long as you always do iPost when you're importing interfaces and naming them. So just something to bear in mind. I'm going to do a private method here. Again, this is something that you don't have to do. And I'm going to set it confusing again. I'm going to call it post and post model. Now, you don't have to do this because you can just use the post model directly. Basically, this just means that I have to do this dot post dot create. For me, that feels nicer than writing post model dot create. It's up to you how you do that. You can do it however you want. So for this, I'm going to follow some good practices and create a comment. And I'm just going to say create a new post. It's quite nice to have this because then you know what the functions are doing. I mean, some of them are obvious. Like we're creating a create function. So it's quite obvious what that does, but you may also want to write about and you don't really need to do this with TypeScript. I was going to say you could write about the parameters, like the type of the parameters and the parameters it needs. But with TypeScript, it's already included in the function definition, so you don't really need to do that. But just an idea, you can. There's other stuff that you can do in comments that will make things nicer when you're writing code. So we're going to create a public function. It's going to be async create, and it's going to accept title, which is going to be a string, and a body, which again, string, and it's going to return promise, and it's going to be of type post. So that's why we included this interface here. It's saying the value is never read. Oh no, there we go. Yeah. So basically the warning here is that we haven't actually returned anything in this function, even though we're meant to be returning post. So what we'll do is do another try catch. Apologies. Const post equals await this dot post dot create, and we're going to pass in title and body, and then that will return post. So it'll assign the result of this to post, and then we'll return it back to our controller. Otherwise, we can throw an error and pass through some text, unable to create post. Now, this is really up to you, again, and I might advise doing this. So basically, our post service is done now. You can add new methods as and when you need them. So we only need create at the moment, but you could add update or delete or something like that. In your controller, we need to do this, private post service. So it's actually the same, but the thing with the post service is because it's a class, we actually need to initialize it. So I'm going to initialize it here. Again, you can probably do this in the constructor, for example, but I'm just going to do it here. Might as well. So that's pretty much everything done. The thing that I was going to say that you might want to do is in here we're not in here. In our service, we're throwing an error if it goes wrong, and we're adding an error message. And you can use this error message inside of the controller. So instead of doing cannot create post, you could do error dot message and just rely on the message you send from your service, the function in your service. So if I set that to error dot message, it would pass through unable to create post, as opposed to using cannot create post. Now it's up to you. I would recommend doing the other way, because then you can get some more fine-tuned error messages potentially. But But if you want to do it like this, then just do it like that. It's fine. So this is everything that we need for our API, as far as I'm aware. Oh, we do actually. No, not fully. Not fully. There is something we need to do, and this is important. And I'm glad I remembered it because it is like the most important thing. This is a post controller. Yep. So export that, and we need to use it here. So we do new post controller. Now, here's the thing: it makes it a bit easier to. Oh, actually, no, that's a bit annoying. Okay. The problem that I think does that work? Yeah. Okay. Never mind. Yeah, because it was doing the relative path. Basically, what I did there was just I started typing post controller, and it recognized that I probably want to include this file here because it recognized that it's got the same name. But when it imported it, it didn't use the @ which is what I'm trying to do across my code base, just to keep everything the same. In fact, what I might do as well is just move this app up a little bit, just to make it a bit cleaner. I think that looks nicer. But yeah, it was using the dot, so yeah, just use this @ Again, it's up to you how you do things, but yeah, I'm going to use it @ And basically what we want to do is instantiate the post controller so that it sets up the routes. And what this will do is it'll pass it into your constructor here, controllers, and then pass that into initialize controllers, and then it'll loop through your controllers and set them up using your router, which is going to be in here, this here, and then routes get added to this router through initialize routes, and that all gets added to the main Express router, and then it makes it so you can access these routes. Hopefully that's not too confusing. You can look through the code and sort of get to know how it all works. Hopefully I explained it somewhat well, but any issues, let me know in the comments, and I'll get to them. Hopefully I can answer them, and I can clear stuff up in later videos as well if needs be. What we'll do is we'll run this code and just give it a try. So we do npm run dev. What it should do is it should build our project, and it should start it in compilation mode, as you can see here. And it found an error. Object is of type unknown. This is in validation middleware.ts 25. Validation middleware.ts 25. Alright, so I managed to fix the issue thanks to Stack Overflow. Apparently TypeScript 4, which is weird because I didn't have any issues on my other code base. But yeah, TypeScript 4, this is basically the solution. Passing, or use any as the type on this. It doesn't seem to cause problems anywhere else. It's just for some reason here it's causing an issue. So yeah, just for now, do :any, and I can revisit this if needs be. There might be something more specific I can use. But for now, using any is fine, because we know how this is going to work, so we can sort of ensure that it's going to pass through what we want it to pass through anyway. So yeah, just this :any to solve this. And you can see here it's listening, and it found no issues. One thing we can do, we can test it. I'm just going to change some code in the other browser, in my other screen. And you can see here that it redid the compilation. It's doing incremental compilation, which is faster because it doesn't have to compile everything. So we can test this now. If we open up Insomnia, I use Insomnia, which is a REST client. You might be more familiar with Postman. Use whatever you want to use. I like using Insomnia just because of how simple it is. So we're going to try and do a post, and we'll hope that this works. So if we do post, there we go. 201 created, and we can see here it logged post API/post 201, and it even told us how long it took. So this should now be in our database. If I open up MongoDB Compass, and I should see it inside of here. So I should have probably opened up this before the tutorial, but there we go. There we go. And localhost, I just connect to this, and here we are. Posts, and here we are. So we can do other stuff with this, obviously. You can use this as the base for your own API, and you can basically, this has everything it needs to get going. What I want to cover in the next tutorial is authentication. Obviously, quite an important topic when it comes to creating APIs. So I want to cover that in the next tutorial, and then after that, it's really anything you can think of, because like I said, the way it's set up is you won't need to have really, well, maybe sometimes, but for the most part, you won't need to have watched any of the previous tutorials besides this one. And even then, I'm going to upload all the code to GitHub, and I'm going to tag it as well. So I'll tag this as like the initial version, the base framework, and you know, my future tutorials could be based off of the base framework and not like stuff that I've done, you know, between those tutorials, for example. So they'll all be sort of independent in some way, which makes it easier to sort of get in and see, learn something that you want to learn, because maybe I cover stuff that you already know and you don't want to watch that tutorial, but you want to know some of the other stuff, like maybe the queue system. That's going to be something I'm going to do soon. But you might not want to watch, you know, authentication or anything like that. So that's fine. Any issues, any requests of topics you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe for more content, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.